Most people think the Mafia is only about bullets, blood, and unmarked graves. But in the Moretti family, the biggest secret wasn't a body buried in the foundation. It was a little girl sitting in the dark. Lorenzo Moretti, the most feared Don in New York, controlled the entire eastern seaboard, but he couldn't buy the one thing he wanted: his daughter's sight. For 6 years, Isabella lived in eternal night, declared incurable by the world's top specialists. Then came Jane, a quiet maid with a fake resume and a terrifying secret. She didn't come to clean. She came to do the unthinkable. And when you find out how she opened Isabella's eyes, you'll realize why Lorenzo Moretti had to burn the evidence. The rain in Chicago didn't wash away sins. It just made the pavement slicker for the getaways. Lorenzo the Iron. Moretti stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse overlooking Lake Shore Drive. The glass was bulletproof, 3 inches thick, capable of stopping a sniper round from a mile away. But it couldn't stop the sound of his daughter crying in the next room. "It's the headaches again, isn't it?" Lorenzo asked, not turning around. His consigliere Stefano stood by the door, clutching a fedora in his hands. "Yes, boss. The nurse gave her the sedatives Dr. Arrington prescribed. She's fighting the sleep, though. She's asking for her mother." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. His wife Maria had died giving birth to Isabella. That was the first tragedy. The second was realized 3 months later, when they dangled a bright red rattle in front of the infant's face, and her eyes, milky, unfocused, a pale shade of violet, didn't move. Congenital amaurosis, a genetic defect. "Incurable," Dr. Arrington had said at Mount Sinai. "Hopeless," said Dr. Klein in Zurich. Lorenzo had spent $40 million in 6 years. He had flown in specialists from Johns Hopkins faith healers from the Vatican, and even a shady neurosurgeon from a banned clinic in Moscow. The answer was always the same. "The optic nerve is dead, Mr. Moretti. There is nothing to be done." "Fire the nurse," Lorenzo said, his voice void of emotion. "Boss, she's the 3rd one this month. She let Isabella cry for 10 minutes before administering the meds. I heard it. If she's too slow to stop a child's pain, she's too slow to work for me. Get her out. Severance is 1 month's pay. If she talks to the press, severance is a visit from you." Stefano nodded, accustomed to the brutality. "We have a problem then. The agency is refusing to send more staff. They say the environment is hostile." Lorenzo turned. He was a striking man, 34 years old, with eyes like cold espresso and a scar running through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a knife fight in his 20s. He was handsome in a way that terrified people. "Hostile. I run a criminal empire, Stefano. I don't run a daycare. Find someone independent. Someone who doesn't ask questions. Someone who needs the money enough to ignore the guns at the front door." "There is one applicant." Stefano hesitated, pulling a crumpled file from his jacket. "She came through a contact in the South Side. No agency. Says she used to work in a hospice in Italy. Her name is Jane Rossi." Lorenzo took the file. No photo, just a resume that looked typed on a machine from the 1980s. Experience palliative care, Rome. Skills pediatric specialized care discretion. "Discretion," Lorenzo muttered. "That's the most expensive skill in the world. Bring her in." The interview happened in the library, a room smelling of old leather and cigar smoke. Jane Rossi sat in the high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was younger than Lorenzo expected, maybe 25. She wore a simple grey dress that was 2 sizes too big, hiding her figure. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore thick-rimmed glasses that obscured her eyes. But she didn't smell like fear. Most people sweated when they sat in front of the Don. Jane smelled like antiseptic and lavender soap. "You know who I am?" Lorenzo asked, leaning against his mahogany desk. "You are Lorenzo Moretti," she said. Her voice was calm, with a slight accent that wasn't quite Italian but close enough. "You own half the construction companies in the city and all of the politicians." Lorenzo raised an eyebrow. "You're brave, or stupid. Do you know about my daughter? I know she is 6. I know she is blind. I know she has violent headaches that the doctors treat with sedation," Jane recited. "And how do you plan to handle her when she screams? When she throws things?" Jane looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I won't drug her. Mr. Moretti, pain is a language. She is screaming because she is frustrated, not just because she hurts. She lives in a world of silence and darkness. I will teach her to navigate it." Lorenzo scoffed. "We've had tutors. She refuses to learn Braille." "Because Braille is cold dots on a page," Jane said. "She needs to feel the world, not sound read about it. I can help her, but I have conditions." Stefano stepped forward, hand moving toward his jacket. "You don't make demands of the Don." Lorenzo held up a hand. "Let her speak. What conditions? Total autonomy," Jane said softly. "No nurses hovering over me. No cameras in the child's room. And you," she pointed a slender finger at Lorenzo, "you stop treating her like a broken doll. If I take this job, I answer only to you, but you must not interfere with my methods." The room went silent. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Lorenzo walked around the desk and stopped inches from her. He towered over her, radiating a menace that had made grown men wet themselves. Jane didn't flinch. She just adjusted her glasses. "You have 1 week," Lorenzo whispered. "If she cries, you're fired. If she gets hurt, you'll wish you were only fired." Jane stood up. She was tall, he noticed. 1 week is all I need to start." As she walked out, Lorenzo watched her. There was something about her walk precise, calculated. It wasn't the walk of a maid. It was the walk of someone who knew exactly where the exits were. "Stefano," Lorenzo said, staring at the closed door. "Yes, boss." "Run a background check on Jane Rossi again. Dig deeper. Check Interpol. Check the medical boards in Europe." "You think she's a cop?" "No," Lorenzo said, narrowing his eyes. "Cops have a smell. She smells like a liar. But if she can stop Isabella from crying, I don't care if she's the devil himself." The Moretti estate was a fortress. High walls, armed guards patrolling the perimeter with Dobermans and motion sensors in every hallway. Jane Rossi moved into the servants' quarters on the ground floor. Her room was sparse, but she unpacked her suitcase with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Underneath the piles of modest clothes, she had a false bottom in her luggage. She pried it open. Inside wasn't jewelry or money. It was a collection of glass vials, a set of silver acupuncture needles, and a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes in a language that was a mix of Latin and Cyrillic. She ran her fingers over the journal. "Project Chimera," the cover read. "I'm close," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm inside." She quickly hid the items in the air vent behind the bed and smoothed her dress. It was time to meet the patient. Isabella's room was on the 2nd floor. It was a depressing palace, filled with expensive soft toys that the girl couldn't see. The curtains were drawn, keeping the room in perpetual twilight, though it made no difference to the child. Isabella was sitting on the rug, rocking back and forth. She was a beautiful child with her father's dark hair, but her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. "Go away," Isabella said instantly. Her hearing was razor sharp. "I don't want the medicine." Jane didn't speak. She walked into the room and deliberately knocked over a small wooden block on the shelf. Clack. Isabella stopped rocking. She turned her head. Jane walked to the other side of the room and tapped her fingernail against a glass vase. Ting. "Who are you?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. "You're not Nurse Ratched." "My name is Jane," she said softly. "And I'm not a nurse. I'm just a listener." Jane sat on the floor about 5 feet away. "Do you know what that sound was?" "Glass," Isabella said. "Yes, crystal actually. It sings when you touch it. Do you want to hear it sing?" For the first time in months, Isabella didn't scream. She nodded slowly. For the next hour, Lorenzo watched on the security monitor in his office. He had lied about the cameras. There were cameras everywhere. He watched as this strange woman, Jane, took his daughter around the room, letting her tap objects with a small metal spoon. She wasn't teaching her to avoid furniture. She was teaching her echolocation. "She's treating her like a bat," Stefano noted watching the screen. "She's engaging her." Lorenzo corrected his eyes, glued to the screen. "Look at Isabella's face." Isabella was smiling, a small, tentative smile. But then the mood shifted. Isabella suddenly dropped the spoon and clutched her head, letting out a high-pitched shriek of agony. "Daddy, it hurts." "The fire is in my eyes." Lorenzo was out of his chair, instantly sprinting for the door. By the time he burst into the room, he expected to see Jane panicking, looking for the sedatives. Instead, he froze. Jane had Isabella pinned gently against her chest. She wasn't rocking her. She was pressing her thumbs into specific points at the base of Isabella's skull and behind her ears. She was humming a low, resonant tone, a vibration that Lorenzo could feel in his own chest. "What are you doing? Get the medicine!" Lorenzo roared, stepping forward. "Stay back!" Jane snapped. The command was so authoritative that Lorenzo actually stopped. "The medicine just masks the pressure. It doesn't stop it. Let me work." Jane's fingers moved rapidly, massaging the nerve clusters. She pressed hard, then released. She traced the line of the girl's jaw and pressed 2 fingers directly over Isabella's closed eyelids. "Jane," Lorenzo warned, his hand reaching for the gun in his shoulder holster out of habit. "If you hurt her..." "Shh." Lorenzo watched in disbelief. Isabella's screaming subsided into whimpers, and then silence. Her body, usually rigid with tension during these attacks, went limp against Jane. Her breathing evened out. "The pressure," Jane said quietly, not looking up. "It's not in her eyes. It's in the occipital lobe. The fluid doesn't drain properly. The doctors treat it as a migraine. It's not. It's a blockage." Lorenzo stared at the maid. "How do you know that the top neurologists in the world didn't say that?" Jane turned to look at him. Her glasses had slipped down her nose. Her eyes were striking a piercing amber color that seemed too intelligent for a simple caregiver. "Top neurologists look at MRI scans, Mr. Moretti," she said. "I look at the child. The blockage is structural. I just released the pressure manually. She will sleep naturally now." She picked up the sleeping child and laid her in the bed, pulling the duvet up. Lorenzo felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen men killed, empires fall, and fortunes lost. But he had never seen anyone touch his daughter and take away the pain like magic. "Who are you?" Lorenzo asked again, his voice lower, more dangerous. A palliative care nurse from Rome doesn't know about occipital fluid drainage. Jane stood up and faced him. The air between them crackled with electricity. It wasn't just suspicion. It was an undeniable raw attraction mixed with fear. "I'm the person who can save your daughter," Jane said. "Does the rest matter? It matters if you're lying to me." Lorenzo stepped closer, crowding her space. He smelled of expensive cologne and gun oil. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, contrasting with the threat in his eyes. "If you are playing a game, Jane, understand this. I don't call the police. I handle my problems personally." Jane didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her breathing slightly elevated. "And if I'm telling the truth, if I can give her back her sight?" Lorenzo froze. "That's impossible. Her optic nerves are atrophied." "Atrophied?" "Not dead," Jane whispered. "There is a difference. But the treatment, it is not legal. It is not approved." "I am the Mafia, Jane," Lorenzo growled softly. "I don't care about legal. I care about results." Jane nodded slowly. "Then you have to trust me. Blindly." "I trust no one." "Then watch," she said. "Tomorrow I start the real work, but you must keep the other doctors away. No sedatives, no interference. Just me." Lorenzo looked at his sleeping daughter, then back at the woman who had just performed a miracle with her thumbs. "Fine," Lorenzo said, "but Stefano will be watching you 24/7. "Good," Jane said, turning to leave the room. "He might learn something." As she walked down the hall, Lorenzo pulled out his phone. "Stefano," he said into the receiver, "get me everything on a Dr. Valerius from the University of Bern. I remember a rumor about a radical nerve regeneration project that was shut down 10 years ago." "Why, boss?" "Because—" Lorenzo said, watching Jane disappear around the corner, "I think our maid might be a ghost." 3 days later, the storm over Chicago hadn't broken. Thunder rattled the window panes of the Moretti penthouse, masking the sounds inside. It was 3:00 a.m. The house was asleep, save for the guards patrolling the perimeter, and Lorenzo, who was in his study, drinking a glass of 1942 Don Julio, staring at the security feed. He had been watching Jane for 72 hours straight. She did nothing suspicious. She read to Isabella. She fed her. She played complex, tactile games. But tonight the feed in Isabella's room went black. Lorenzo frowned. He tapped the screen. Static. Then the audio cut out. Lorenzo didn't call the guards. He pulled the Beretta 92 FS from his desk drawer, clicked the safety off, and moved into the hallway. He moved silently, a predator in his own home. He knew every creak of the floorboards. When he reached Isabella's door, it was cracked open. A faint, acrid smell drifted out, not cleaning supplies. It smelled like sulfur and ozone. Lorenzo kicked the door open, leveling his gun. "Step away from her." The scene before him was a nightmare. Isabella was lying on her stomach, asleep. Jane was standing over her holding a syringe filled with a glowing, iridescent blue liquid. She had just injected it into the base of the child's neck. Jane spun around, her eyes wide. She dropped the syringe. It shattered on the floor. "I said, step away," Lorenzo roared. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Jane by the throat, and slammed her against the wall. The gun barrel pressed hard into her temple. What did you put in her poison? Are you working for the Russos? Jane clawed at his hand, gasping for air. No. Let go. Tell me before I blow your brains out against this wallpaper, Lorenzo hissed. His finger tightened on the trigger. He was shaking with rage. The one thing he cared about was being threatened. It's nerve growth factor, Jane choked out. Chimera. Serum. Lorenzo loosened his grip slightly, just enough for her to breathe. What? It's not poison. Jane coughed, rubbing her bruised neck. She didn't look terrified anymore. She looked angry. It's a synthetic protein. It rebuilds the myelin sheath around the optic nerve. It's the only way to reconnect the pathway to the brain. That doesn't exist, Lorenzo said coldly. If it did, I would have bought it. You can't buy it, Jane whispered, because the man who invented it was murdered for it 10 years ago. His lab was burned down. The FDA banned the research. Lorenzo stared at the blue stain on the rug. The smell was intense. And how do you have it? A maid from the south side. Jane straightened her dress. She looked Lorenzo in the eye, the gun still inches from her face. I told you I'm not just a maid. My father was Dr. Augustus Valerius. He created the Chimera Protocol. I'm the only one who knows the formula. And I've been synthesizing it in your kitchen, using the equipment I hid in the pantry. Lorenzo lowered the gun slowly. The name, Valerius. Stefano had mentioned it. The ghost. You're testing an experimental drug on my daughter without my permission. I'm saving her, Jane shot back. The doctors gave up. You gave up. I didn't. Suddenly, a small voice came from the bed. Daddy. Lorenzo spun around. Isabella was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. She looked groggy. Isabella. Baby. Are you okay? Does it hurt? Lorenzo rushed to the bed, holstering his gun. He grabbed her small hands. Isabella blinked. Her milky eyes were watering. She looked around the dark room, then toward the window where a flash of lightning split the sky outside. Daddy, she whispered, her voice trembling. I saw the sky crack. Lorenzo froze. What? The sky? She pointed to the window. It was bright, just for a second, like a white line. Lorenzo looked at Jane. The maid was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, a red mark forming on her neck where he had strangled her. She looked exhausted, but triumphant. She perceived light, Jane said softly. The optic nerve is responding to the electrical storm. It's working, Lorenzo. It's working. Lorenzo looked back at his daughter. For 6 years, she had seen nothing. Nothing. And now, after 3 days with this woman, she saw lightning. He stood up and walked over to Jane. The tension in the room shifted from violence to something else, something heavy and suffocating. He reached out his hand, hovering over the bruise on her neck. I could have killed you, he said. I know, she replied. If you ever turn off the cameras again. Lorenzo said, his voice low and husky, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear. I will kill you. Do you understand? Jane shivered. It wasn't from cold. I had to. I couldn't let the footage exist. If the pharmaceutical companies know the serum exists, they will come for me. And they will come for Isabella. Lorenzo pulled back and looked at her. He saw the fire in her amber eyes. She was a fugitive, a scientist on the run, and she was hiding in the lion's den. Let them come, Lorenzo said, a dark smile playing on his lips. I've been looking for a fight. He turned to leave. Get some sleep, Dr. Valerius. Tomorrow we go shopping. If you're going to save my daughter, you can't look like a beggar. The Moretti Winter Gala was the social event of the season in Chicago. It was held at the Palmer House Hilton, a venue of gold leaf ceilings and velvet drapes. It was a charity event for the blind. A cruel irony that Lorenzo insisted on hosting every year to maintain his public image as a legitimate businessman. I'm not going, Jane said, standing in the foyer of the penthouse. You are going, Lorenzo said, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked devastating in a bespoke Brioni tuxedo. Isabella needs her caregiver, and I need protection. You have 20 armed guards, Jane scoffed. They are muscle. They don't have your eyes. Lorenzo gestured to a garment bag held by Stefano. Put it on. Jane took the bag. Inside was a dress of deep crimson silk, backless, with a slit that went up to her thigh. It was a dress meant to distract, a weapon in fabric form. When Jane walked down the stairs 20 minutes later, the conversation in the living room stopped. The guards stared. Stefano cleared his throat awkwardly. Lorenzo simply watched her, his expression unreadable, though his eyes darkened. She wasn't wearing her glasses. She had put in contacts. Her hair was down, cascading in dark waves over her bare shoulders. The bruise on her neck was covered with makeup. Isabella is ready, Jane said, her voice cool. Isabella was wearing a matching red velvet dress, holding Jane's hand tightly. You look... Lorenzo stepped forward, offering his arm. Adequate. Jane smirked. You're welcome. The drive to the Palmer house was tense. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Lorenzo's hand rested on his knee, inches from Jane's leg. The air in the limo was thick with unspoken words. The Salvi family will be there tonight, Lorenzo said abruptly. Don Salvi is trying to move in on my union contracts. If he approaches you, I'm just the nanny, Jane said. You are the woman standing next to me, in this world that makes you a target. The ballroom was packed with Chicago's elite politicians, judges, and mobsters pretending to be respectable. Lorenzo navigated the room like a shark in a koi pond, shaking hands and smiling while his eyes scanned for threats. Jane stayed close, guiding Isabella, describing the room to her in hushed tones. The ceiling is gold, Bella, like the sun. The carpet is soft. Well, well, Lorenzo. A voice like grating metal cut through the music. Marco Salvi, the underboss of the Salvi family, stepped in front of them. He was a thick-set man, with a nose that had been broken too many times. Marco. Lorenzo nodded. Enjoying the wine? It's better than the swill you serve at your clubs. Marco laughed, but his eyes drifted to Jane. He looked her up and down, lingering on her chest. And who is this? I didn't know you hired models for the help now. Marco reached out to touch Jane's arm. Before Lorenzo could move, Jane shifted. It was subtle. She didn't recoil. She stepped into the space, her hand brushing Marco's wrist, hitting a pressure point on his radial nerve. Marco flinched, his hand jerking back as if he'd been burned. What the hell? I'm Isabella's governess, Jane said, her voice sweet as honey. And you're standing on the child's dress. Please move. Lorenzo saw it. He saw the precision. She hadn't just pushed him. She had disabled his hand for a good 30 seconds. Marco was rubbing his wrist, looking confused. Let's go, Lorenzo said, guiding them away. He leaned close to Jane. Radial nerve compression. He has bad circulation, she replied innocently. The night wore on. The speeches began. Lorenzo went to the podium to speak about the charity. Jane stood near the back, near the kitchen service entrance, holding Isabella's hand. That was when she saw them. 3 waiters. They weren't moving like waiters. They were moving in a formation, triangulating the room. Their jackets were bulky on the left side. Jane scanned the room. Lorenzo was on stage, a spotlight blinding him. He couldn't see the floor. One of the waiters reached into his jacket and pulled out a suppressed MAC-10. Jane didn't scream. She didn't panic. She reacted with the muscle memory of a soldier. "Isabella, get down!" she hissed, shoving the child under a heavy catering table. Jane grabbed a steak knife from a passing tray and kicked off her high heels. The gunman raised the weapon toward the stage. Jane threw the knife. It wasn't a clumsy throw. It was a perfect rotation. The blade embedded itself in the gunman's wrist. He screamed, dropping the gun. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the hall. The other 2 assassins drew their weapons, firing blindly towards the stage. Lorenzo dove behind the podium, pulling his own gun. "Get the girl!" one assassin yelled. They weren't after Lorenzo. They were after Isabella. It was a kidnapping. One man lunged toward the table where Isabella was hiding. Jane intercepted him. She looked like a red blur. She caught the man's arm, used his own momentum to flip him over her hip, and drove her elbow into his windpipe. The crunch was audible over the screaming crowd. The man collapsed, gasping for air. The 3rd assassin turned his gun on Jane. She was unarmed. He was 5 feet away. "Die, bitch!" he sneered. Bang! The assassin's head snapped back. He fell dead. Jane looked up. Lorenzo stood on the edge of the stage, his gun smoking. He had made the shot from 50 feet away through a panic-stricken crowd. Their eyes locked across the ballroom. Blood was pooling on the marble floor, staining the hem of Jane's red dress. She wasn't shaking. She was standing over Isabella, ready to kill again. The Moretti guards swarmed the room, securing the exits. Stefano ran to Lorenzo. "Boss, we have to go the Salvis!" Lorenzo ignored him. He jumped off the stage and walked straight to Jane. He looked at the man choking on the floor, the one Jane had throat-punched. "You broke his trachea," Lorenzo said, looking at her. "Cleanly." Jane was breathing hard, her adrenaline spiking. He was going for Isabella. Lorenzo reached out and wiped a speck of blood from her cheek. "Dr. Valerius, tell me the truth. You weren't just a scientist, were you?" Jane looked at the carnage around them. "My father's research was valuable, Lorenzo. When the government came for it, I didn't just learn to hide. I learned to hunt." Lorenzo grabbed her hand, interlocking his fingers with hers. The sirens were wailing outside. "Good," Lorenzo said, pulling her and Isabella toward the back exit. "Because we're going to war, and I need a queen who knows how to kill." They didn't go back to the penthouse. It was compromised. Lorenzo took them to the Vault, a safe house built into a decommissioned bank vault in the basement of an unsuspecting office building in downtown Chicago. The walls were 2 feet of reinforced steel. There were no windows, only high-definition screens simulating daylight. For 2 weeks, the world outside burned. Lorenzo's soldiers waged a brutal war against the Salvi family. Bodies were found in the Chicago River. Warehouses exploded. The city held its breath. But inside the vault, a different kind of war was being fought. Jane had turned the medical bay of the safe house into a laboratory. Equipment stolen from top hospitals by Lorenzo's men lined the walls. "This is the final phase," Jane said, her voice tight with exhaustion. She hadn't slept in 30 hours. She was holding a vial of the synthesized serum now a deep, pulsating violet color. Isabella lay on the medical bed, holding a teddy bear. She looked small and fragile. "Is it going to hurt?" Lorenzo asked. He was leaning against the door frame, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the tattoos on his forearms. He looked more tired than Jane. "Yes," Jane said honestly. "The nerves are waking up after 6 years of atrophy. It will feel like fire. But if we stop now, the pathways will scar over. She will be blind forever." Lorenzo walked over and brushed the hair from Isabella's forehead. "Bella, do you trust Jane? She smells like lavender and gunpowder," Isabella said, her voice sleepy from the mild sedative. "She keeps the monsters away." "That she does," Lorenzo murmured, looking at Jane. The relationship between Lorenzo and Jane had shifted into something dangerous. They moved around each other like binary stars, drawn together by gravity, but terrified of the collision. They hadn't kissed, they hadn't slept together. But the intimacy of keeping this child alive was more binding than any marriage. "Do it," Lorenzo commanded. Jane administered the injection. The reaction was immediate. Isabella arched her back, a scream tearing from her throat that shattered Lorenzo's heart. "Daddy, my eyes are burning." "Hold her," Jane shouted, grabbing a cold compress. Lorenzo pinned his daughter's shoulders to the bed, tears streaming down his own face. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. Squeeze my hand." This went on for 4 hours. 4 hours of agony. Jane worked tirelessly, massaging the pressure points, adjusting the IV drip, whispering commands in Italian to the weeping child. Finally, Isabella passed out from exhaustion. Lorenzo slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Jane walked over to him. She was trembling. She reached out and touched his shoulder. Lorenzo grabbed her hand and pulled her onto his lap. It wasn't sexual. It was a desperate need for contact. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent. "Tell me it was worth it," he rasped. "It will be," Jane whispered, running her fingers through his dark hair. "When she wakes up, the bandages come off. We will know then." Lorenzo lifted his head. His eyes were dark, intense. "You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met." "Is that a compliment? In my world, it's the highest honor." He leaned in. The kiss was inevitable. It was bruised and desperate, tasting of coffee and fear. Lorenzo kissed her like he wanted to consume her, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against him. Jane responded with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair. For a moment, they weren't a don and a fugitive scientist. They were just two people keeping back the dark. But the moment was shattered by a sound. Beep, beep, beep. Not a medical monitor. Lorenzo froze. He pulled back his eyes, snapping to the security console on the wall. The proximity alarm. "Someone is in the elevator shaft," Lorenzo said, his voice instantly cold. He stood up, pulling his gun. "This facility is off the grid. Only 3 people know the location. Me, you." He looked at the door. "And Stefano." The heavy steel door of the vault shuddered. A thermal lance began to cut through the lock mechanism. Sparks showered the floor. "They found us," Jane said, grabbing a scalpel from the tray. "Take Isabella," Lorenzo ordered, racking the slide of his Beretta. "Go to the panic room in the back. Do not come out until everyone out here is dead. Lorenzo, go," he roared. As Jane scooped up the sleeping child and ran for the rear reinforced door. The main vault door exploded inward. Smoke filled the room. Through the haze, men in tactical gear poured in. They weren't Salvi Street thugs. They moved with military precision. On their vests was a logo Jane recognized from her nightmares: Etheris Pharmaceuticals, the company that killed her father. They hadn't just come for the serum. They had come to erase the evidence. And walking behind them, looking shameful but resigned, was Stefano. "I'm sorry, boss," Stefano said, his voice shaking. "They offered me amnesty. They said you were going to destroy the family for a blind girl." Lorenzo stood alone in the center of the room, raising his gun. "You chose the wrong side, Stefano." The firefight was deafening. Lorenzo was a marksman, but he was outnumbered 10-1. He took cover behind the heavy medical equipment, firing calculated shots. 2 mercenaries went down. But they were pushing him back. "Flashbang!" one of the soldiers yelled. A canister rolled to Lorenzo's feet. He dove away, but the blast disoriented him. His ears rang. A boot kicked the gun from his hand. Lorenzo looked up, blinking through the spots in his vision. The mercenary leader, a man with a scarred face, pointed a rifle at Lorenzo's chest. "Secure the girl," the leader said into his comms. "Kill the Don." "Wait," a voice said. Stefano stepped forward. "You promised no killing if he surrendered." The leader laughed and shot Stefano in the chest. The consigliere fell without a sound. "Loose ends," the leader grunted. He turned back to Lorenzo. "Goodbye, Mr. Moretti." Click. The lights in the vault went out. Total, absolute pitch blackness. The mercenaries panicked. "Night vision. Get the thermals up." I can't see anything. My goggles are whiting out," one soldier screamed. "It's a jammer," the leader yelled. "They're jamming the IR frequencies." In the darkness, a sound echoed. Click. Ting. It was the sound of a metal spoon hitting a glass vial. Lorenzo smiled in the dark. He knew that sound. It was echolocation. Jane wasn't in the panic room. A scream pierced the dark. Then another. The wet sound of a blade meeting flesh. The mercenaries were firing blindly, their muzzle flashes illuminating brief, horrific vignettes. Flash. Jane dropping from the ceiling pipes, her legs wrapping around a soldier's neck. Flash. Jane sliding across the floor, slicing an Achilles tendon with a scalpel. Flash. Jane standing over a fallen man, using his own body as a shield. She was a ghost in the dark. She didn't need eyes. She had trained herself for this. She had trained Isabella for this. Back to back, the leader screamed. "She's here!" Lorenzo scrambled in the dark, finding his gun by touch. He didn't need to see to know where the leader was. He listened to the breathing. But then the emergency lights flickered on a dim red glow. The leader saw Jane. She was standing by the medical bed, blood on her grey dress, holding a combat knife. But she was exposed. The leader raised his rifle. "Got you!" He pulled the trigger. But Lorenzo threw himself in front of her. The bullet hit Lorenzo in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard. "No!" Jane screamed, lunging forward, but the leader backhanded her with the rifle butt. She crashed into the cabinets, dazed. The leader stood over them, panting. Only 3 of his men were left standing. "Enough games. Where is the girl?" The panic room door hissed open. The leader spun around, gun raised. Isabella stood in the doorway. She had pulled the bandages off her face. Her eyes were open. The leader hesitated. "The blind brat." Isabella looked at him, and for the first time in her life, She didn't look past him. Her violet eyes locked onto his face. Her pupils contracted in the red light. She pointed a shaking finger at a gas line running along the wall behind the leader, a line damaged by the earlier explosion, leaking invisible vapor. "Jane!" Isabella screamed. "The blue pipe! Shoot the blue pipe!" She could see the color. Jane didn't hesitate. She grabbed the gun from the floor and fired, not at the leader, but at the blue pipe behind him. Boom! A jet of flame erupted from the gas line, engulfing the mercenary leader. He screamed as the fire consumed him. The concussion wave knocked the other two soldiers down. Lorenzo, bleeding and gripping his shoulder, saw his chance. He raised his Beretta with his good hand. Bang! Bang! The last two mercenaries fell. Silence returned to the vault, save for the hissing of the gas fire and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Lorenzo dragged himself upright. He looked at the panic room door. Isabella was standing there, blinking tears from her eyes. She looked at her hands. She looked at the blood on the floor. And then she looked at Lorenzo. Her eyes widened. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder washed over her face. "Daddy," she whispered. Lorenzo forgot the bullet hole in his shoulder. He scrambled to his knees. "Isabella!" She ran to him. She didn't stumble. She didn't feel for obstacles. She ran straight into his arms, burying her face in his chest. "You look like your voice," she sobbed. "You look strong." Lorenzo Moretti, the Iron Don, wept openly. Jane slumped against the cabinets, watching them. She was bruised, bleeding, and exhausted. But she was smiling. Lorenzo looked up at her over his daughter's head. "You did it," he mouthed. Jane nodded weakly. "We did it." But the war wasn't over. The Aetheris Corporation was still out there. And they knew. The war didn't end in the vault. That was just the opening shot. Lorenzo Moretti sat by the hospital bed in a private wing of Northwestern Memorial, a floor he had bought and paid for entirely. Isabella was sleeping, but for the first time in 6 years, her eyelids fluttered in response to the morning sun streaming through the window. Jane stood by the window watching the city below. She wore a borrowed change of clothes, her face pale, a bandage on her forehead where the mercenary had struck her. "She asked for you," Lorenzo said, breaking the silence. "Before she fell asleep. She wanted to know if you were a ghost." Jane turned, a sad smile playing on her lips. "To the world I am. Dr. Valerius died in a fire 10 years ago. Jane Rossi the Maid doesn't exist. I have no name, Lorenzo." Lorenzo stood up and walked to her. The distance between them had vanished. They were survivors of the same shipwreck. "Then we give you a new one." He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for a black velvet box. He didn't open it yet. He just held it. "But first," Lorenzo's voice dropped, the temperature in the room plummeting. "I have to clean the house. Stay with her." Jane looked at his eyes. They were back to being the iron. "Where are you going?" "To remind the devil why he lives in hell." Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Aetheris, sat at the head of a 20-foot mahogany table. He was a man who believed money was a shield that could stop bullets. He was wrong. "The stock is down 4% because of a rumor," Thorne yelled at his board members. "Kill the story. Bribe the editors, I don't care." "Mr. Thorne," his secretary buzzed in her voice, trembling. "There is a gentleman here to see you." Security isn't responding. The double doors of the boardroom didn't burst open. They swung open slowly, deliberately. Lorenzo Moretti walked in. He was alone. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Thorne's car. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a king arriving to an execution. "Who are you?" Thorne demanded, standing up. "Security." "Your security is currently napping in the stairwell," Lorenzo said smoothly, pulling out a chair at the opposite end of the table and sitting down. "And I'm the father of the little girl you tried to burn alive last night." Thorne's face drained of color. He sat back down slowly. "Moretti, I heard you were indisposed." "I was," Lorenzo said. He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished table. It stopped exactly in front of Thorne. "But then my daughter saw my face out for the first time. It put me in a very productive mood." Thorne opened the envelope. His hands shook. Photos. Not of him, but of the secret labs in Peru. The illegal testing on orphans, the order forms for the hit on the Moretti vault, signed by Thorne himself. This is fake," Thorne stammered. "It's already on the servers of the FBI, the FDA, and the Washington Post." Lorenzo lied effortlessly. "But I haven't hit send on the encryption key yet." "You have 10 minutes. "What do you want, money?" Thorne sneered. "I can pay you double what you're worth." Lorenzo laughed. It was a dry, terrifying sound. "I don't want your money, Marcus. I have enough money to buy God a drink. I want your life." Thorne reached for the panic button under his desk. "Go ahead," Lorenzo taunted. "Press it. See who comes." Thorne froze. "Here is the deal," Lorenzo said, leaning forward. "You are going to sign over the patent rights for the Chimera serum to a trust in my daughter's name. Then you are going to confess to the embezzlement of company funds to cover up your gambling debts." "I don't have gambling debts," Thorne said, confused. "You do now." Lorenzo smiled. "My hackers were very thorough this morning." "And if I refuse?" Lorenzo checked his watch. "Then I leave. And in 5 minutes, the Salvi family, who are very upset that you hired them for a botched job, will walk through to those doors. I told them you were the one who leaked their location to the police." Thorne gasped. The Salvis would skin him alive. Lorenzo was offering him prison. The alternative was torture. Thorne grabbed a pen. He signed the papers with shaking hands. "Wise choice," Lorenzo said, standing up and retrieving the documents. "Enjoy federal prison, Marcus. I hear the food is terrible." Lorenzo walked out. As he entered the elevator, he pulled out his phone. "Did he sign?" Jane's voice came through the line. "He signed. The patent is ours. Isabella's treatment is legal now. And the Salvis. The police are raiding their warehouse as we speak. I planted the drugs there an hour ago," Lorenzo said, loosening his tie. "It's over, Jane. The city is ours." The ceremony wasn't held in a church. It was held in the conservatory of the Moretti estate, a room made entirely of glass. Isabella, now fully recovered, stood as the flower girl. She wore a dress of pale lavender. For the first few weeks of her sight, she had been overwhelmed. The world was too bright, too fast. She had cried because the color red looked angry, and the color blue felt cold. But Jane had guided her through it, just as she had guided her through the dark. Now Isabella watched with wide, hungry eyes as the woman who saved her walked down the aisle. Jane didn't wear white. She wore a gown of champagne silk, simple and elegant. She walked with her head high, no longer the maid hiding in the shadows, but the matriarch of the most powerful family in Chicago. Lorenzo stood at the altar. When he saw her, the breath left his lungs. He had killed men, toppled empires, and survived wars. But nothing terrified and thrilled him as much as the woman walking toward him. When she reached him, he took her hands. "Do you take this man?" the priest asked. to have and to hold from this day forward. Jane looked at Lorenzo. She looked at the scar on his eyebrow, the lines of stress that were slowly fading from his face. She looked at Isabella, who was waving at a butterfly on a flower arrangement, seeing it in perfect clarity. "I take him," Jane said, her voice strong, "and I take the dark with the light." "And do you, Lorenzo?" Lorenzo didn't look at the priest. He kept his eyes on Jane. "I take her, and I promise that as long as I breathe, no shadow will ever touch her again." 1 year later. The terrace of the Villa Moretti in Tuscany overlooked a sea of green vines and golden sunlight. Isabella was sitting at a canvas, holding a paintbrush. She was painting the sunset. It was a messy, abstract explosion of oranges and purples, but to Lorenzo it was a masterpiece. "She has an eye for composition," Jane said, setting down a tray of espresso and biscotti. Lorenzo was reading the newspaper. "Iteris CEO found dead in cell." The headline read. He folded the paper and set it aside. The past was dead. "She has your focus," Lorenzo said, pulling Jane onto his lap. Jane rested her head on his shoulder. She was pregnant, just a few months along, but the bump was showing. A new life, a new legacy. "You know," Jane whispered, tracing the line of his jaw, "when I came to your house that first day, I had a cyanide capsule in my tooth. I was going to kill myself if you found out who I was." Lorenzo kissed her forehead. "And when you walked into my office, I had a sniper across the street, aiming at your head in case you were an assassin." They both laughed. It was a dark, twisted laughter that only they could understand. "We were a disaster waiting to happen," Jane said. "No." Lorenzo corrected her, turning her face to kiss her deeply. "We were a storm, and storms clear the air." "Daddy Jane," Isabella shouted from her easel, pointing at the horizon. "Look!" The green flash. I saw the green flash. Lorenzo and Jane looked out at the sun dipping below the hills. The world was bright. The world was clear. "I see it, Bella," Lorenzo called out. He held his wife close, his hand resting on their unborn child, and finally, for the first time in his life, the Don closed his eyes. He didn't need to watch for threats anymore. His family was the light, and the light was blindingly beautiful. And that is the full uncut story of the Mafia boss and the maid who healed him. From the darkness of a blind child's room to the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany, Lorenzo and Jane proved that family isn't just about blood, it's about who you're willing to bleed for. I really hope you enjoyed this expanded ending. The scene where Isabella paints the sunset always gets me. It's amazing to think she went from total darkness to painting the world. If you loved this story, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm find more listeners like you. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. I'm working on a new story about a billionaire who hires a homeless woman to be his fake wife, only to realize she's a runaway princess. You don't want to miss that one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.